Shavua Tov, everyone. Today's daf is Safin Daf Kufav. Today's daf is sponsored by Rena Septi Goldstein and Mark Goldstein on the occasion of the Yurt site of Rena's father, Mo Septi, Moshe ben Harav Elazar Shmuel, Ish Shalem, Ish Shalom. Okay, today's daf, we have another good daf, relevant, full of information that's relevant. I hope you all enjoyed Havdalah last night, with knowing all that you had learned this past week. And now we're going to learn more things about Kiddush and Havdalah, some other interesting elements. And again, a good example of all sorts of customs that you wonder sometimes where did they come from, and today we will learn about them. So we're going to start right now at the top of our page. If you recall, where we were at the end of yesterday's daf was we had a braita quoted at the beginning of Kuf Hamud Bet. Okay, I'll just quickly read the braita. Nechnas lebeito b'motzei Shabbat, one who comes home, presumably they assumed from shul on Saturday night. Mevarech ala yayin v'ala ma'or v'ala psamim. Okay, this was not the order that we hold like, but this was the order in the braita. First, you make a bracha on the wine, then the candle, then the spices. Achar kachomer Havdalah al kos, and then you say the blessing of Havdalah on the cup of wine. If he only has one cup, he waits till after he eats his meal, and then basically he does all the brachot together. Now, we said you can derive from this 8 things. And before we even start, I want to point out this number, because what we're going to see is Rav Ashi takes 2 of them and says, really, 2 of these are really one and the same, and it's really only 7. And I was thinking about what motivated him to do that. And if you think about it, and I mentioned in the class from yesterday that often they say Shmami Natzlat, like 3 is this magic number. You often learn 3 things from something. It's usually in 3s, not always, but often. It's we learn from here 3 things. 3 is one of these numbers that comes up all the time in the Torah and Tanakh and in the Gemara. It's kind of one of these, you can't really say round, but not an even number. And so we get to talking in a few days about even and odd numbers and fears of Zugot and all that. But 3 was one of these special numbers. Maybe actually that's why, now that I'm thinking about it, because we're going to get in a few days to this issue of pairs are problematic. And that's why 3 and 7 are both odd numbers. And maybe there's a reason why these are the chosen numbers. There's also all sorts of Kabbalistic reasons. 7, so is this number of the 7. The 7 has this magic number, Shabbat 7, all sorts of numbers are 7. In any case, it could be that, and we just saw that when you talk about how many Havdalot, either 3, the minimum, maximum 7. So it could be that they also want to get to this number 7, and that has some significance as to why Rav Ashi is doing this. But in any case, let's start with Rav Ashi on the second line of today's daf. Rav Ashi amar ta'amo p'gamo. If you drink it, it messes up the cup. We talked about yesterday what's the reason. Because it's like a leftover cup, right? Someone else drank from it. Right? We don't want to drink from someone else's cup. It's not respectful. If you want to use a respectable cup for Kiddush, for any kos shabracha. But that and kos shabracha tzarich shiur chad mil tehi. That is exactly the same as a kos of bracha needs a requisite amount. Now, he clearly understands ta'amo pigamo is a little bit different. He assumes that your cup is exactly a revid. In which case, if you drink a little bit, you're not going to anymore have the requisite amount that you need. Remember, the revid is a quarter of a log. So he thinks the ta'amo p'gamo just has to do with the fact that it's missing something. It doesn't have the requisite shiur, and therefore those 2 are actually the same reason. And you end up really only learning 7 things from this braita. And he said, hachi kamar, and this is what they really meant to say when they said we learn several things from here. It really should read like this. My time atamo pagamo. What is the reason why it becomes a kos pagum when you drink from it? Mishum de kos shabracha tzarich shiur, and this no longer has the requisite amount. But not everybody agrees that this is the reason for a kos pagum, and we're going to see a few different approaches here. Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi kapit achatzba pagima. He said, forget about a cup, okay, which is a revi. But even if you have a jug and someone drank from that jug, it's a problem. Now, there's a bit of a debate here about whether they mean that they drank from it, or maybe even just they opened it. And maybe like people like to use a new bottle of wine and it's not appropriate to use a bottle that was already open. Maybe that's what they're referring to. It's unclear because most people didn't drink straight from the jug. Although maybe they're saying if you drank from the jug. It's a little more difficult to understand it from the continuation. But Rabbi Idi bar Shisha kapira kasa pegima. He's disagreeing with Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, and he says, no. This doesn't have to do with jugs. This has to do with cups. It's only an issue with cups. It's not an issue with jugs. We're not worried if the jug, again, was either opened or maybe someone drank from it. Marbar ashi kapet afilu achavita pagimta. He says even a barrel that was pagum. Now, again, it's unclear what it means pagum. It's a lot of different interpretations about what this means. Is it just that you open the barrel? And then that would be really difficult. Every time you want to make a kosher bracha, you need to open a new barrel of wine. To which the Rashbam says, again, different Gemaras have a line differently. Mine has it on the second wide line of the Rashbam. Kapid akasa pagima. Sorry, no, it's a few lines beyond that. I'm on the wrong one. About 6 lines on mine down from where they get wide. Afilu achavita chaviyot ktanot. He says only small barrels. We're not talking about large barrels. Okay, because I have to imagine people didn't drink straight from the barrel. So again, what exactly it means pagum is not very clear from here. Maybe someone did drink from the barrel and then it would mess up the whole barrel. Or does it mean that, and then if it does mean drink, so let's say it was a huge barrel according to the Rashbam, if someone drank from it, it doesn't mess it up, which is weird, right? You would think that if tasting it does mess it up. Obviously you're thinking here of germs and, it's unclear whether they really were worried about people's germs or it just wasn't any more respectful, or it was opened, right? We all know once you open the wine, it already, right, the air gets there, it already lessens the significance, or the wine is already not as good. So anyway, it's unclear. And this is why the halachot regarding kos pagum are a little bit unclear. There's different opinions. There's ways you can fix a kos pagum. You can pour more water in. There's debate, is that even after you drank it, you could do that, or if you used it but didn't drink from it, like often people pour from the wine into something else so that they don't actually drink from the cup, and then they could leave over the leftovers for someone else to make Kiddush on. So there's all different debates about a kos pagum. It's a whole halachic issue, and actually a pretty relevant one, because we don't often drink the entire cup. So what do you do with the rest of that cup? Can you use it? Can't you? If you drank from it, it's a problem. If you didn't drink from it, it's not a problem. So there's all sorts of, also it's a question to all the people listening who drink, can they drink from a kos pagum? So let's say you make Kiddush and you drink from the cup and then you pour into the other cups. Is that a problem? Do you have to drink from your own cup and then, right, pour it into a separate cup and then pour for everybody else? So all these debates come up from here. And as you see, they're not so clear about what exactly the issue is. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to get to the whole issue of Kiddush at night versus Kiddush during the day, which is the main Kiddush, which is less central, which is the more obvious one, which is not. Now, before we even start, let's just talk about the structure of Kiddush. So Kiddush at night is made up of Vayichulu, which is this kind of declaration of the whole creation of the world and why we have the concept of Shabbat, which we end with Borei Pri Hagafen. And then we make a second blessing about the sanctity of Shabbat. And that's called Mekadesh HaShabbat, sanctify Shabbat. And that's the second blessing. So there's 2 blessings at night. During the day, here you get into many different customs. The base of Kiddush, we're going to learn this today, is just the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. There's no 2 blessings. It's only one. So you don't have the Mekadesh HaShabbat bracha, which is already an indicator that it's not the same as Kiddush, right? Think about the words. Mikadesh is Kiddush, comes from there. So there's no sanctification or anything going on in this blessing. There are sections that come before it. Different people have different customs, whether you say, some people say the short version and just say, Al Kain Be'erach Hashem Yom Shabbat Ketsheu. That's why God bless this day. And you say, Borei Pri Hagafen. Some people have Im Tashim B'Shabbat Reglecha and the whole section there. Some people have V'Shamru and Zachor, and it's Zachor first, then V'Shamru. There's all different versions of Kiddush. But the main Kiddush is not all those sections that come before it. As we talked about the development of prayer, that's an example of when the prayer developed, right, over time. But the main thing is really the blessing, okay? Other sections came in later. So now the Gemara starts off with a braita that's not going to be understood very clearly, and they're going to have to reinterpret it. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. So where does the whole issue of Kiddush come from? From where do we know that we have to make this declaration, make it on wine? How do we know this? So Zachor Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, zachreu ala yayin. So what does it mean to remember the Shabbat? To sanctify it. To remember to sanctify means talk about the significance of Shabbat on a cup of wine. That's how they interpret it to me. Ainli ala b'yom. So okay, it says Zachoret Yom HaShabbat, the day of Shabbat. So the obvious would be the day. Now this goes exactly against what I just said, that the main Kiddush is at night, it seems. But this seems to say the main Kiddush is in the day. Balayla minayim. Where do we get that we say Kiddush at night? Talmud Lamal, the verse says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho. It's because the verse says you should remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it. Now, that's not a very good proof for the fact that you say Kiddush at night. It doesn't say anything about night. It doesn't say anything about a second Kiddush. It's very unclear. So the Gemara is going to question this from two directions. Number one, Balayla minayin. Wait, Kiddush is in the day is obvious and at night is less obvious? Adraba, it's the exact reverse. Ikar Kiddush balayla hu Kaddish. Now, why is the Ikar Kiddush balayla? Forget about I proved it because of the blessings. The question is, what's the reason? Because the whole idea of Kiddush is what? As soon as Shabbat comes in, and this is why we talked about Poles Mapal B'Kadesh, or do you have to stop your meal, or right? As soon as Shabbat comes in, you need to sanctify it. You need to say a declaration. Now it's Shabbat, and that was the whole debate. Do you have to? Is Shabbat sanctified anyway? Right? That's the whole debate about Mafsikin Suda that we started with. But it seems even if you hold it, you don't have to stop your meal. At some point at night, you have to bring in Shabbat and say the words of Kiddush. So it doesn't make any sense to say that it's obvious that it's during the day. So now they say, and additionally, the two is additionally, Balayla minayin Talmud Lomar Zachoret Yom. The whole second line doesn't make any sense. You're going to say, okay, so at day it's obvious. At night, how do we know it? Because it says sanctify the day of Shabbat. Tana mehadar alayla. The Tana was trying to find the pasuk for the nighttime. V'kanasiv lekradi yamama, and you bring a verse that talks about the daytime. That makes absolutely no sense. So they reread this source and they say hachi katane. This is how you should read the Braita. Zachor et yom Shabbat l'kacho, and they changed the words, which we've seen many times because they were passed down orally, and sometimes mistakes happen. Zachor et yom Shabbat l'kacho. What's the obvious? Zachreu alayayim b'knisato. Right? The first time they say, remember the day of Shabbat, they don't mean the day, literally the day. They understand, remember Shabbat by sanctifying it. How do you do that? As soon as it comes in, you sanctify it, right? Unless, of course, you're in the middle of a meal and you hold like Rabbi Yossi, that you have to do it immediately, but at least soon after immediately. Now, Ein li ala balayla. Then they say, wait, but that's only at night. But Yomi nayin, where do we get the daytime? Talmud Lomar. Now it makes sense. Zachor Yom Shabbat. It says specifically day. So because of that, we learn additionally, we do it during the day. But the main thing is when it comes in. So now, the Gemara wants to know, by Yom Mai Mevarech. So what do we say during the day when we make Kiddush? Amar Rav Yehuda, Borei Pri Agafen. And this is where we see it. It's just Borei Pri Agafen. It's nothing more. That's it. That's what Kiddush is. There's no Vishamru here. There's nothing else is added here. It's just the bracha Borei Pri Agafen. Rav Ashi ikla leMechoza. Here we have a good story. Rav Ashi comes to Mechoza, a city he's never been to, I guess, or certainly not on Shabbat, and or maybe he has been, but the situation never happened. And they start to ask him something. And here we learn about what happens when you come into a new place and you don't really know what goes on in their town. Amrule likdish lamar Kidusharabha. They say to him, now it was obviously during the day. You'll see from the continuation. It's Shabbos day, and they say to him, oh, Rav Ashi, you've come. You're a big mechuba guest. Please get up and say Kidusharabha for us. Now, what does Kidusharabha mean? The great Kiddush. Now, if you would think, what's the great Kiddush? Friday night davening would be the great Kiddush. Shabbos is the very short Kiddush of just Borei Pri Agafen. So he's a little bit confused by their lingo. And Amar, he says to himself, so now he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to ask because it's a little embarrassing. Rav Ashi is going to say, what is Kidusharabha? I don't know what you're talking about. He could have, but he did it. So instead, he comes up with a solution. How am I going to figure out what this Kidusharabha is? Like he assumes, normally I just say Borei Pri Agafen, but maybe they call it Kidusharabha because maybe they have a custom. And this is a good question. Is this an indicator that there was a custom to maybe say Mekadesh HaShabbat during the day? I'm not sure, but maybe. And at least he thinks to himself, maybe that's their custom. And that's why they call it Kidusharabha, because even during the day, they make the bracha also Mekadesh HaShabbat. So he says, what does he say to himself? He says, well, michti kol brachot kulam borei pri agafen amrei bereisha. All brachot, and really what it means is kiddushes. Right? When you make kiddush, what do you always say first? The first blessing is always borei pri agafen. And then you say mekadesh HaShabbat. So what comes up with this great solution? He says, amar borei pri agafen. So he says borei pri agafen, ve'agid bei, and he kind of slows the ending. Borei pri agafen, okay? And as he slows the ending, he looks around and he says to himself, well, if I see people start drinking the wine, obviously you learn from here that everyone had cups of wine in front of them. They weren't waiting for him to pour the wine. If I see someone drink, then I'll know that that's the end of Kiddush. So he does that. He sees an elderly guy who picks up the cup and starts drinking, and he realizes, he says about himself, right? Oh, I was smart, right? I figured out how to figure out this without embarrassing myself. So you see some interesting things here about, rabbis coming to different places and in general, right? When you come to a new place and you don't really understand, right, what's the best way to do things? I mean, obviously the best way in communication, we all believe in communication, and why don't you just ask? But sometimes it's not appropriate. And it's also not so appropriate in terms of, and we've talked about this many times, the respect for Talmidei Chachamim. Like for some people, if Kidusharabha is so obvious to them, then they'll wonder, like, how could he not know what Kidusharabha is? And it might make them start to disrespect him. So that is a separate thing, right? Forget about his own kavod, but it's kavod of Torah that he has to protect. They start disrespecting him in terms of that, then they might disrespect him in other ways. So why is it called Kidusharabha if it's actually a short Kiddush? So some people say it's Lashon Sagina Hor. We've seen this before, where we didn't want people to minimize it, so we call it the Great Kiddush, and that way people will take it seriously, because otherwise it's just a Borei Pregaf and people might not take it so seriously. That's one reason given anyway. And in modern day Hebrew, people call a Kiddush in the morning a Kidusharabha. It comes from here. If you're having a Kiddush Shabbos morning, many people use that language. I'm inviting you to a Kidusharabha. Amrei b'nei Rabbi Chia, the sons of Rabbi Chia said, Mi shelo hivdil b'motzei Shabbat, mavdil v'holech b'chol Shabbat kulo. Now we're on a different issue. If you didn't make Havdalah on Motzei Shabbat, you can make Havdalah later in the week. Sounds like the entire week. So this is the sons of Rabbi Chia, who were the first generation Emoraim. Comes Rabbi Zera a few generations later. I believe he's third generation. Amar Rabbi Zera, I skipped a word, ad kama, until how far into the week? You could really go the whole week, the Gemara asks. So Rabbi Zera says, ad revi'i b'Shabbat. It's true they said the whole week. They didn't really mean the whole week. They meant till Wednesday, meaning really till Tuesday. It means ad revi'i, which is already Tuesday night. Kihani they bring us support for this. Kiyati yativ Rabbi Zera kamei de Rav Asi. The proof is either from Rabbi Zera himself, who just said this opinion, or possibly Amrele Rav Asi kamei de Rabbi Yochanan, or it's possible as Rav Asi was sitting in front of Rabbi Yochanan when they said the following, V'yativ b'ka'amal, li'inyan gitin, this is for a different issue. This is when it comes to a get, divorce document, or sometimes get is used for general documents, not necessarily just a divorce document, but any document that has a stipulation. If in the stipulation they stipulate before Shabbat or after Shabbat, like for example, sometimes people will give a get with a condition, this will be your get under the condition that you give me something, right? We all unfortunately know this is often used as, negotiation, or it could be, it'll be your get if I don't return by a certain time, or all sorts of conditions it could be. And if you say la'achara Shabbat or lifnei Shabbat, what do you mean? Okay, what does that include? So if you say la'achara Shabbat, chad b'shabta t'chrei utzlata batar shabta. So when you say after Shabbat, that includes the first day, the second day, and the third day of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Arba v'cham shel malei yoma, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is considered Kamei Shabbat, is considered before Shabbat. So again, this is language that we use in other places also, and we're going to apply it for the same thing for how long you can do Havdalah. This also relates to, if you remember, the sugyot we saw in Shabbat about the boat travel. How many days before or after? There were a lot of sugyot that had this distinction, and then we actually mentioned this, which is the 3 days before Shabbat, the 3 days after, right? You could go on a boat 3 days before Shabbat. You can go on a boat before 3 days before Shabbat, but not specifically 3 days before. Or if you're going to do elective surgery, some people say don't do it a few days before Shabbat because it might cause you to be Mechalel Shabbat, and that's learned out from one of the opinions of how to learn the boat travel. So anyway, there's all sorts of things that this has ramifications for. Okay, now one last point about this before we move on to our next interesting topic. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, aval lo ala ol. Okay, you don't make the bracha on the candle, and by the way, also not on the besamim. Doesn't say that, but it's also included lahalacha because those two are specifically Saturday night related, right? The besamim or your neshama yitera, right? You want to feel good as you're leaving Shabbat, where your sad Shabbat is leaving. So you have besamim already. Once it's Sunday, that you're beyond that. And the candle, either because the candle was created on fire was created on Motzei Shabbat, or because we want to note that distinction between now we're allowed to light candles. So therefore we use the light, but once it's already beyond that and it's already been permitted, so you don't need to do that. Amar Rav Rona Amar Rav. Now comes this very famous sugya. Rav Rona says in the name of Rav, Hanotel Yadav Lo Yikadesh. Okay, there's all sorts of ramifications for the sugya. We're going to see a bunch of them. If you wash your hands for netilat yadayim for the bread, since you're not allowed to make any break, we all know, right? That's why people go, right? And they don't talk and all that. So by the way, first of all, you are technically allowed to talk as long as it has to do with what your bread and your eating of the bread. If you need to pass the tray, you're allowed to say pass the tray. You don't say, right? And nobody knows what you're talking about and it gets everybody frustrated. But you're not allowed, what's the whole issue? You can't take your mind off of the next stage of what you're doing. You're washing in order to eat the bread. You can't have a break. So is Kiddush considered a break or not? Okay, we're going to get, I know you're all thinking, what about the Yeki minhag of those people who wash before Kiddush? So we'll see. Right now, we're assuming there is no such thing as this Yeki minhag. It says here, if you were to have done it, you cannot make Kiddush. That means if you're at a table, you accidentally washed, you forgot maybe they were doing Kiddush, I don't know why, but you washed. You can't be the one to make Kiddush. Someone else at the table has to make Kiddush. Not clear here if you can answer Amen or not, but you can't make Kiddush because that's already considered a break. So he says this, Rabbanit says it in the name of Rav. Amar Luhu, Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, Rav Yitzchak, the son of Shmuel, son of Marta, says to him, Akate lo nach nafshei de Rav shachachinu lishmatete. Rav has just died and you already forgot what he taught you. Okay, if you have a good memory, you're going to remember that in Masechet Brachot, you have to have a good memory for this. We had a story that Rav had died, and on the way home for the funeral, they didn't know this halacha about whether they sat down to eat on the go, and they weren't sure, did they count for a zimun or not? I see heads nodding yes, so I'm glad you remember. So, often stories we remember well. So, and then somebody gets very upset with them, and he says, Rav just died, and you don't remember the halacha. And I think that these stories are indicative of this terrible loss they felt when Rav died. Right? Rav was this tremendous Talmid Chacham. He was of the greatest Amoraim, the first one, that existed. And imagine how traumatic it was when he died. And people got very upset at the aftermath of his death, right? Here, all of a sudden, people are forgetting halachot, so they respond very strongly. And they say, right, I actually tried to search for the story to remember all the details. And when I did the search, I tried to use these words. It didn't say exactly these words. I had to search a little bit differently. It didn't say akate lo nach nafshei de Rav. It wasn't exactly this wording, but it was similar. And when I looked up nach nafshei de Rav, I was able to find it very easily. But it doesn't say, akate lo nach nafshei, right? He hasn't, he just died and you've forgotten what he said, but it's the same exact understanding. So now, what did they forget about Rav? Now, it's interesting because Rav didn't exactly say this. And that's why I think that they're trying to get at this idea of evoking the sadness that they felt and the loss that Rav was no longer with them, because it's not like Rav said exactly this. You have to make a little bit of a jump from what Rav did to this halacha. Many times I sat before Rav on a Shabbat meal. Sorry, I skipped a line. Zimnin de chaviva ale rifta makadesh rifta, zimnin de chaviva ale chamra makadesh chamra. Sometimes he preferred to eat bread, so he made Kiddush on bread, and sometimes he preferred to drink wine, so he made Kiddush on wine. In other words, Rav, different from what we do, Rav would sometimes make Kiddush on bread, sometimes make Kiddush on wine. What does this have to do with our question? Well, the point is that if he made Kiddush on bread, what would he do? He would say vayechulu. Okay, it's very hard to understand this because we don't generally do this. Although if you're stuck in a place without wine, you can definitely do this. So this is very practical. For whatever reason, you would not have wine or grape juice, you would make Kiddush on bread. And this is, by the way, we're going to get into tomorrow. What are all the things you can use for Havdalah? And the rules for Havdalah and Kiddush are very different. Because for Kiddush, you can make Kiddush on bread now, and you can't for Havdalah. Why is that? Because Havdalah has no meal associated with it, whereas Kiddush does. Right? It's interesting because we always say Kiddush b'makom suda. That's Shmuel, not Rav. Rav didn't think you had to have Kiddush b'makom suda, but even though we didn't hold that you have to, clearly on Friday night they would have Kiddush with their meal. So because of that, Rav says because the meal is important, the bread is very significant for us on Friday night because it makes up our meal, and our meal is important. Therefore, since it has significance, you can make Kiddush on bread. Whereas Havdalah, there's no connection to bread, so Havdalah you can't, and that's why Havdalah ended up developing that in the event that you don't have wine, you can use other things. And that's going to be tomorrow's sugya, which is one of my favorite sugyas because it shows how over time, right, when in the time of the Mishnah, they had tons of wine. I mean, you walk around this country, there's wine presses everywhere and vineyards growing, but not all the time were they living in places where they had access to wine. And then they had to make some other options for people. And that's how halacha develops, right? Based on situations. And then the question will come back. We'll get to it tomorrow. Well, what about today when we all have plenty of wine? Maybe you can't use something else. And anyway, we'll get to a whole discussion about that tomorrow. But in any case, how does this connect with if you wash your hands, Kiddush isn't a break? Because let's say on the day that he would decide, I'm in the mood for bread, I'm going to make Kiddush on bread. So what would he do? He would wash. He would say, Vayichulu. Instead of Borei Peri Agafen, he would say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Then he would say the second blessing, Mekadesh Shabbat. So obviously that blessing is not a break because then he'd only eat the bread after. He didn't eat the bread immediately after saying Hamotzi. So that shows that it's okay and that you can eat the bread after. And even though you said Kiddush, you said this Mekadesh Shabbat blessing in the middle. So the same would be the case. It gets a bit of a jump, but presumably it's not enough of a break to say that you've broken you're on a different topic and you'd have to wash again. So basically, Rav Rona starts off in the name of Rav and says you can't make Kiddush. And Rav Yitzchak comes and says, no, you obviously can, from Rav himself. And, I think you're wrong based on Rav's minhag, what he used to do. Now, what's interesting about this is halacha l'maaseh, and how do we get to this yeki minhag, bichlal, about, this? So, and by the way, there's another interesting thing that comes out of it that also we'll kind of see tomorrow, but I guess I'll talk about it today, which is there's a difference, again, because this relates to what we learned earlier today about the difference in Kiddush at night and Kiddush during the day. This is only true, the bread issue, some people say, and I think it makes a lot of sense, only for Kiddush at night and not for Kiddush during the day. Why is that? That's why people for Kiddush during the day often use other things, but almost no one uses liquor and things like that at night. And why is that? Because during the day, you can't use bread. Why can't you use bread? Because all you do is borei pri agafen. So if you say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, okay, this is from what I recall the Rush says this. If you would say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, it would look like you're just eating a meal, and it wouldn't look like you're making Kiddush. Again, even if you say v'shamru and zachor, that's not a halachic thing. That's just nice text they added. But there's no extra blessing, mekadesh Shabbat. The only way it looks different is because we're making a special blessing before we eat. So before hamotzi, we say something, and that's why it doesn't really matter if it's shahakol or borei pri agafen. It's just that you're making something before, right? So that is an indicator that I'm doing something lichvod Kiddush. Whereas if you just do it on bread, it just looks like you're eating your meal and moving on, and that you've skipped Kiddush. So that's why there's this distinction between Friday night and Shabbat. So now I want to get to the yeki minhag. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, in Orach Chaim Siman Resh Ayin Aleph, in Seif Yud Bet, 12th Seif paragraph, it says, Achar shekidesh al kos. Okay, they're basically telling you the order, okay, in case you didn't know. So after you make Kiddush on the cup, notel yadav u'mevarech al netilat yadayim. So you make the bracha al netilat yadayim, and im natal yadav kodem Kiddush. Now he says it a little differently than the Gemara does. If you were to wash before Kiddush, he says, don't forget about the yeki minhag. Tirifta chaviv alei, I skipped two words, very important words. Gale date. If you wash before Kiddush, it's an indicator that you're like Rav and you wanted to make it on hamotzi. And therefore, he says, Lo yikadesh ala yayin ela ala pat. So if you wash before, then you must make Kiddush on bread. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Okay, it's interesting because you wouldn't have thought about this, and it's definitely different than the yeki minhag, which again, the yeki minhag is there's people from Germany who basically make Kiddush. Before they make Kiddush, they wash, they make Kiddush and hamotzi. It's very organized that way because it's not like everyone before they gather at the table, they wash and then they come to the table and then you do everything. It actually makes a lot of sense from an organizational perspective. So where does it come from a halachic perspective, though? It's clearly not what it says in the Gemara. The Gemara had a whole question. Is Kiddush a hefsek? In the end, they said it's not, but it's not like they recommended you should do this. But the Ramah says, Haggah, this is the Ashkenazi footnotes in the Shulchan Aruch. Or not exactly footnotes, but notes. Some people say you're actually supposed to do this in an ideal sense. Okay, ideally you should wash before Kiddush and then make Kiddush on wine. And he says, and in these places, everybody does this. Why Leil HaPesach? Because if you wash before Kiddush, well, you're stuck. You can't do magi. You can't speak until you do the bread, which is way later. So that's obviously the one exception, which is nice. That's our issue, right? But I wanted to read because it's still unclear where do they get this from. So the Mishnah Berurah there says in the small seif samach aleph. To svira le de ein kiddush mikre hefsek. Basically, they think the kiddush is not a hefsek. Shoot sorach hasuda because it's for the meal. And then Yivarech Hamotzi, right? And he says, since it's not a hefsek, the Ramah thinks that Tovlin Hokin. In other words, maybe they thought it was more organized that way, and they said, well, since anyway we prove in the Gemara that it's not any sort of break, so maybe this is actually ideal, even though it clearly isn't ideal from the Gemara, but something motivated them, and it could be that it was just a better organized meal motivated them to say better to do it this way. Okay, and once it was allowed, they then took it to, well, maybe we should do this ideally. So that's interesting information. Okay, let's move on in terms of understanding where these customs develop from, right? It happened, I was Shabbat at a friend's, and their son who's 13 started asking me questions about how the grandma alarm worked and how you can use this alarm on Shabbat. And he was questioning, and we tried to explain to him what the logic was. And then he said, well, then why do people say it's forbidden? So, if you think it's allowed, then why do some people say it's not allowed? So I said to him, well, that's why you learn Gemara, because when you learn Gemara, you realize why some people say something's allowed and other people say something's not allowed, because there's just many different ways of interpreting things. And that leads to all different opinions. And that exactly, right? Kids like to know black and white. It's either yes or it's no. And it's definitely not like that in Halacha. And the more you learn Gemara, the more you realize. So today's daf is a good daf for that. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Now we're moving on to the last topic of today. Ta'am eino mekadesh. If you eat something, you can't make Kiddush. Meaning you're not allowed to eat before Kiddush. And if you did, we're going to penalize you and you're not allowed to make Kiddush. You have to push it off till the next day. So Rav Huna says this in the name of Rav, and now Rav Chana bar Chinana asks Rav Huna the following question. Ta'am ma'u sheyavdil. Is it the same thing for Havdalah? So Amar le, ani omer, he's specifically saying I say, because I guess he didn't learn this from Rav. So he says, my opinion is Ta'am Havdil. It's not the same. If you ate before Havdalah, you can make Havdalah, but if you ate before Kiddush, you're not allowed to make Kiddush. It's a big question, by the way. If you can't make Kiddush, are you allowed to eat your meal? Or do we penalize you that you can't even continue eating your meal? Or do we say, no, you just can't make Kiddush? And then the question is, what kind of a penalizing is it? I don't know. But anyway, it's an interesting question. For Rav Asi Amar, we're going to see a bunch of different opinions here. Ta'am eino mavdil. He doesn't talk about Kiddush, but he says you don't make Havdalah. Okay, as opposed to Rav Huna, who said you do make Havdalah. Rav Asi says you don't make Havdalah. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba ikla lebe Rav Asi. Now we're going to have another story. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba comes to the house of Rav Asi. Ishtale v'tayim nidi. He forgets and he eats something before Havdalah. Havule kasa v'avdil. They brought him a cup and he made Havdalah. Now this is strange because Rav Asi himself said you don't make Havdalah. We penalize you. So interesting. Who pipes in here? Amarle debitu. His wife sees what's going on and says, "What's going on here?" V'ha marlo avid hachi. But you don't do this. You say that if somebody drinks or if somebody eats, they can't make Havdalah. So what's going on? Amar las. He says to her, "Shavke ki rabbe svirale." No, I'm pluralistic here, right? In other words, even though he's in my house, I'm not forcing him to keep my opinion. I know he holds by his rabbi's opinion. I know there's a debate about this issue. And I know that he holds by his rabbi's opinion, who holds by the opinion that we saw, that you don't have to repeat, you don't have to wait till tomorrow when it comes to Havdalah. And therefore, leave him be. Let him make his own Havdalah, right? There's room for everyone's opinion, and don't be upset that he's doing something against what I hold. Amar Rav Yosef Amar Shmuel. Now we're bringing a halacha in the name of Shmuel. Ta'am eino mekadesh, ta'am eino mavdil. According to this, it's the same for Kiddush and Havdalah. You can't do either. The Rabba Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. This is a different tradition in the name of Shmuel also, which is the exact opposite. Ta'am mekadesh v'ta'am mavdil. You can do Kiddush and you can do Havdalah even if you ate. So there's many different approaches here. It's whether both yes, both no, or maybe Kiddush no and Havdalah yes. Again, showing this distinction that we keep talking about, differences between Havdalah and Kiddush, which we're going to also see tomorrow, like I said, about what wine or not wine products are allowed to be used. If you don't have wine for Kiddush or Havdalah, can you use other things? So again, we're constantly trying to figure out what is Kiddush, right? It's Kiddush and Havdalah, one and the same, because again, we saw today, Kiddush is bringing in Shabbat and Havdalah is bringing out Shabbat. So maybe they're really one and the same. And how are they different? So here there's debates about, do we treat them the same or do we treat them differently when it comes to the issue of eating before or not? So, are we stringent in general? Are we lenient in general on this issue? Do we penalize people or do we not penalize people? With that, we'll finish for today. You'll have to wait till tomorrow to see what the halacha is on this topic, which we're going to start with tomorrow's daf. You could take a sneak preview if you're really interested. So if you have a week till next week's Havdalah. So have a great day, everyone, and we will Shavua Tov, and we will pick up tomorrow.